They laughed at Edward when he married Bethany, a fat black woman with seemingly impossible dreams, convinced he was throwing his future away. But years later, those same people looked on with envy as their lives blossomed into something extraordinary. What transformed their love story into the fairy tale everyone now desires? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The small-town diner's bell chimed as the door swung open, letting in a burst of warm summer air. Edward looked up from wiping down the counter, his artist's eyes immediately drawn to the woman who walked in. She moved with a grace that seemed to light up the whole room, her curved figure wrapped in a flowing yellow sundress that matched her radiant smile. "Welcome to Mary's Diner," Edward said, his voice catching slightly as she chose a seat by the window. Sunlight streamed in, creating a natural spotlight that made her dark skin glow. He couldn't help but notice how some of the regular customers started whispering, their eyes following Bethany as she settled into her booth. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, new faces always drew attention, and not always the kind. "Can I get you started with something to drink?" Edward asked, approaching her table with his notepad. Up close, he noticed how her eyes sparkled when she smiled, despite the sideways glances from other customers. "Just water for now, thank you," Bethany replied, her voice warm and confident. She didn't seem bothered by the stares, though Edward saw something in her eyes that suggested she was used to them. As Edward filled her water glass behind the counter, his fingers itched for his sketchbook, tucked safely in his backpack beneath the register. There was something special about the way she held herself, proud and elegant, despite the whispers. During his break, while Bethany enjoyed her chicken sandwich, Edward quietly pulled out his sketchbook. His pencil moved swiftly across the paper, capturing the gentle curve of her smile, the determined set of her shoulders, the way her hands gestured gracefully as she checked her phone. "Did you see her? Must be from the city," he overheard Mrs. Peterson whisper to her friend at the counter. "Girls around here know better than to dress like that." Edward's jaw tightened at the comment, but he kept sketching, trying to capture the dignity in Bethany's expression that these small-minded people couldn't or wouldn't see. When Bethany stood to leave, she walked with the confidence of someone who knew their worth, even if others didn't see it. Edward watched her go, then looked down at his sketch. He'd captured something in those quick lines, not just her features, but a spark of something more. Dreams, maybe. Determination. The kind of beauty that went far deeper than what these townspeople seemed capable of understanding. The bell chimed again as she left, and Edward carefully tucked his sketchbook away, already knowing this wouldn't be the last drawing he'd make of her. In a town that seemed determined to judge what it didn't understand, she was like a splash of color on a canvas of gray, impossible to ignore, and all the more beautiful for standing out. Over the next few weeks, Bethany's visits to Mary's Diner became a regular occurrence. Every Tuesday and Thursday, right around 1 o'clock, she'd come in for lunch. Edward found himself looking forward to these moments, his sketchbook always ready. Each time she visited, Edward noticed something new to capture in his drawings. The gentle way her hands cradled her coffee cup, the determined set of her jaw when she read modeling magazines, the soft curve of her neck when she looked out the window lost in thought. One afternoon, as Edward served her usual order of grilled chicken salad, he overheard a group of teenage girls at the next table snickering. "Did you see her latest Instagram post?" one whispered loudly. "She actually thinks she can be a model, as if anyone would want to see that." Another girl joined in. "My mom says it's bad enough being..." She lowered her voice, glancing at Bethany. "You know, black in this town. But thinking she can model at her size? That's just asking for trouble." Edward's hands tightened around the coffee pot he was holding. He watched as Bethany's shoulders tensed slightly, but she kept her head high, taking another bite of her salad with deliberate grace. Her eyes might have glistened a bit more than usual, but her dignity never wavered. Later that day, while cleaning tables, Edward overheard two older men discussing Bethany as well. "Bethany girl needs to give up those big city dreams," one said, shaking his head. "Ain't nobody want to see somebody like her in magazines." But Edward saw something different. In his sketchbook, pages filled with studies of Bethany's face and figure, he captured the strength in her presence, the elegance in her movements. His artistic eye recognized the classical beauty in her proportions, the way light played across her dark skin, the perfect composition of her features. During quieter moments at the diner, Edward would add more detail to his sketches, the confident tilt of her chin, the way her whole face lit up when she smiled, the elegant drape of her colorful dresses. Each drawing felt like a small act of defiance against the town's cruel whispers. One particular drawing stood out: Bethany reading her modeling magazine, sunlight streaming through the window, her expression full of hope and determination. Edward had captured not just her physical appearance, but something deeper, her unwavering spirit in the face of constant judgment. The more Edward observed Bethany, the more his admiration grew. It wasn't just her outer beauty that captivated him. It was her resilience, the way she carried herself with such grace despite the daily barrage of cruel comments and dismissive looks. In his sketches, he tried to capture that inner strength, the quiet dignity that the townspeople seemed blind to. Each time she left the diner, head held high despite the whispers and stares, Edward found himself adding another sketch to his growing collection, each one a silent tribute to her courage and determination. One quiet afternoon, as the lunch rush dwindled and golden sunlight streamed through the diner's windows, Edward gathered his courage. His heart hammered in his chest as he approached Bethany's table, clutching his coffee pot like a shield. "Would you like a refill?" he asked, his voice softer than intended. Bethany looked up from her magazine and smiled. "Yes, please." As Edward poured the coffee, his eyes fell on the magazine she was reading, Modern Beauty. The cover featured a striking plus-size model in a flowing red dress. "That's a beautiful photo spread," he said, nodding toward the magazine. Bethany's eyes widened slightly, surprised by his genuine interest. "It is. They're finally starting to showcase different types of beauty." Edward set the coffee pot down and, after a moment's hesitation, slid into the seat across from her. "I've noticed you reading these magazines often. Are you interested in modeling?" A shadow of uncertainty crossed Bethany's face, but she lifted her chin. "I am. Though most people around here think that's ridiculous." "I don't think it's ridiculous at all," Edward said quietly. "I'm an artist, actually. I notice beauty in places others might miss." Bethany's expression softened. "An artist? Working here at the diner?" Edward laughed nervously. "Yeah, well, my parents wanted me to go into business like my father. This job, it's my way of proving I can make it on my own." "I understand that," Bethany said, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup. "My family thinks I'm chasing impossible dreams too. They want me to be practical, settle for a regular office job." "But that's not who you are," Edward said. "No, it's not." Bethany's voice grew stronger. "I want to show other girls like me that they're beautiful too, that they don't have to hide or change who they are." Edward nodded, understanding filling his eyes. "That's a powerful message. Most people just laugh when I tell them that," Bethany admitted, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "Well, most people in this town don't see very clearly," Edward replied, surprising himself with his boldness. A genuine smile spread across Bethany's face, reaching her eyes in a way Edward had never seen before. It was different from her usual composed expression, more vulnerable, more real. The moment was interrupted by the clatter of dishes from the kitchen. Edward glanced at the clock, suddenly aware of how long he'd been sitting there. "I should get back to work," he said, standing up reluctantly. "Thank you," Bethany said softly. "It's nice to talk to someone who actually listens." As Edward returned to his duties, he felt lighter somehow, as if crossing the space between them had lifted a weight he hadn't known he was carrying. And from the way Bethany's shoulders had relaxed, the way her smile lingered, he sensed she felt it too. The next few days brought a gentle shift in their routine. Bethany began staying longer at the diner, choosing the quiet corner booth where sunlight painted warm patterns on the worn tabletop. Edward would join her during his breaks, their conversations flowing easier with each passing day. "The worst part isn't even the mean comments," Bethany confided one afternoon, pushing her half-eaten pie around the plate. It's the fake concern. Oh, honey, maybe you should try this diet. Or, are you sure modeling is the right path for you? Her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes remained steady. Edward's hand tightened around his pencil as he worked on another sketch of her. That must be exhausting, he said softly. It is. But you know what keeps me going? Bethany straightened in her seat. Last week, a little girl came up to me at the grocery store. She was a chunky little thing, maybe 8 years old. She told me I was pretty just like her mom. Bethany's eyes grew misty. That's why I can't give up. For girls like her. Edward nodded, adding gentle strokes to capture the determination in her expression. His sketches had evolved over the days, no longer just quick studies of her features, but detailed portraits that captured her spirit. The way her eyes lit up when she talked about her dreams, the quiet strength in her posture, the genuine warmth of her smile. Can I see? Bethany asked, gesturing to his sketchbook. Edward hesitated for a moment before sliding it across the table. Bethany's breath caught as she flipped through the pages. There she was, page after page, but not just her physical appearance. Somehow, Edward had captured something deeper, her dignity, her grace, her unwavering hope. Edward, she whispered, touching one of the drawings gently. Is this really how you see me? It's how everyone should see you, he replied quietly. Strong, beautiful, unstoppable. Tears welled in Bethany's eyes. Yesterday, someone told me I should stop kidding myself. That no one would ever want to photograph someone who looks like me. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. But I went home and practiced my runway walk anyway. Edward reached across the table and squeezed her hand briefly. That's what makes you extraordinary, Bethany. Not just your beauty, but your courage. You keep walking forward, no matter what they say. A small smile tugged at her lips. Sometimes I get so tired of being brave. Then let others be brave for you sometimes, Edward said, taking back his sketchbook and beginning a new drawing. This time, he captured her vulnerability, the quiet strength it took to keep dreaming in a world that tried to dim her light. They sat in comfortable silence, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the diner floor. Edward's pencil moved across the paper, each stroke filled with growing admiration for the woman before him who refused to let the world define her worth. The following week, Edward and Bethany fell into a comfortable routine. She would arrive at the diner around 2 p.m. when the lunch rush had died down, and they would share quiet conversations over coffee and pie. Edward noticed the whispers first. Mrs. Henderson, who'd been coming to the diner for 20 years, pressed her thin lips together when she saw them talking. The group of retired men who played cards by the window would pause their game to stare. Their weathered faces creased with disapproval. Your parents stopped by the art supply store yesterday, Bethany mentioned one day, stirring her coffee slowly. Your mother didn't look too happy to see me there. Edward's shoulders tensed. He knew his parents, especially his mother, held certain views about who he should associate with. I'm sorry, he said softly. They can be difficult. That's a nice way of putting it. Bethany's smile was gentle but tired. The clerk followed me around the whole time, like I might steal something. Edward felt a familiar anger rise in his chest, but Bethany reached across the table and patted his hand. Hey, it's okay. I'm used to it. You shouldn't have to be, he replied, pulling out his sketchbook. Drawing helped calm his nerves, and Bethany's presence always inspired him. As days passed, they began meeting outside the diner too. They would walk through the small town park, where Edward would sketch the way sunlight filtered through the trees while Bethany practiced her runway walk on the winding paths. Children would sometimes stop to watch her, their faces curious and open, until their parents hurried them away with uncomfortable glances. At the local coffee shop, the barista would serve them with a tight smile, always placing Edward's cup directly in front of him, but sliding Bethany's across the counter with barely a glance. Edward noticed how Bethany's shoulders would square up in these moments, her chin lifting slightly higher. Sometimes I think about leaving this town. Bethany admitted one afternoon as they sat on a park bench. But then I remember what my grandmother used to say. Change has to start somewhere, baby. Might as well be with you. Edward looked up from his sketchbook where he'd been capturing the determined set of her jaw. Your grandmother sounds wise. She was. Bethany smoothed her skirt, a habit Edward had noticed she did when gathering her thoughts. You know, people talk about you too now. I've heard them wondering why a nice boy from a good family would spend time with. She trailed off, but Edward could fill in the blanks. Let them talk, he said firmly, adding shading to his sketch. Their words say more about them than about us. The afternoon light caught the gold threads in Bethany's braids as she smiled at him, and Edward quickly added that detail to his drawing. Around them, people walked by with curious glances and whispered comments, but in that moment, their judgment felt distant and unimportant. One warm afternoon, Edward's hands trembled slightly as he unlocked the door to his small studio apartment above the diner. The space was cramped but filled with natural light from 2 large windows, and every wall was covered with his artwork. He watched nervously as Bethany stepped inside, her eyes widening as she took in the paintings. Edward, she whispered. These are... Her voice trailed off as she moved closer to the nearest canvas. He had arranged his newest pieces in a careful sequence along one wall. Each painting captured Bethany in different moments, laughing at the diner, deep in thought at the coffee shop, walking confidently through the park. But these weren't just simple portraits. Edward had painted her the way he saw her, radiant, powerful, beautiful. In one piece, she stood tall against a backdrop of swirling colors, her curves celebrated in bold, confident brushstrokes. Another showed her face in profile, her expression serene and strong, with golden light seeming to emanate from within her. Bethany moved slowly from one painting to the next, her hand pressed to her heart. Edward could see tears forming in her eyes. Is this really how you see me? Her voice was barely above a whisper. Edward stepped closer, his heart pounding. Yes, he said simply. This is exactly how I see you. She stopped in front of the largest canvas where he had painted her in a pose reminiscent of a fashion magazine cover. But unlike the airbrushed models in those glossy pages, this painting celebrated every curve, every feature that made Bethany uniquely herself. The background shimmered with various shades of gold and amber, making her seem to glow from within. My whole life, Bethany said, her voice thick with emotion. People have looked at me and seen someone who needs to be fixed, someone who needs to be different. She turned to face him, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. But you've painted me exactly as I am, and somehow made me look beautiful, Edward finished softly, because that's what you are. Bethany reached out and touched his arm, her fingers warm through the fabric of his shirt. No one has ever seen me like this before, she whispered. Edward found himself moving closer, drawn by the vulnerability in her eyes. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, he reached up and gently wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. They stood there for a moment, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows, surrounded by paintings that told the story of how Edward saw Bethany. Strong, beautiful, and worthy of being celebrated exactly as she was. Bethany took a shaky breath, her gaze still fixed on the paintings. Her fingers traced the edge of one canvas, not quite touching the paint. Sometimes, she said quietly, I wake up in the morning and wonder if I'm just fooling myself. Edward stayed silent, giving her the space to continue. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the studio floor. Yesterday at the grocery store, I heard Mrs. Peterson telling her friend that I was living in a fantasy world. And last week, someone left a cruel note on my car. Bethany's voice wavered. They said no one would ever want to see someone like me on a magazine cover. Edward's hands clenched involuntarily at his sides. Those people, he said softly, they're the ones living in a fantasy world. They're stuck in their narrow little boxes of what beauty should look like. Bethany turned to face him, her eyes glistening. But what if they're right? What if I'm just setting myself up for disappointment? She gestured at her body. Look at me, Edward. I don't look anything like the models in magazines. No, you don't, Edward agreed, moving to stand beside her. You're something entirely different. Something real. He pointed to one of his paintings where he'd captured her laughing. Her whole face lit up with joy. That spark, that life in you, that's what makes you beautiful. That's what makes you perfect for modeling. The agencies don't seem to think so, Bethany said, her shoulders slumping. I've sent out so many applications. Then they're missing out, Edward said firmly. Your determination, Bethany, it's incredible. Do you know how many people would have given up by now? But not you. You keep pushing forward, keep believing in yourself even when this small-minded town tries to tear you down. A tear rolled down Bethany's cheek. Some days it's so hard to keep believing. Then believe in what I see, Edward said, guiding her back to the paintings. Look at how strong you are in this one. See how you hold your head high, even when people stare. That's the real you, Bethany. That's the woman I see every time you walk into the diner. Bethany wiped her eyes, studying the painting. You make me feel brave, she whispered. Like maybe I'm not crazy for dreaming big. You're not crazy at all, Edward said. You're changing things, whether this town realizes it or not. Every time you refuse to hide, every time you keep going despite their judgment, you're showing others it's okay to be themselves. Bethany turned to him, her expression softening. Thank you, Edward, for seeing me. Really seeing me. I just paint what's already there, he said gently. Your strength, your beauty, it's all you. I'm just lucky enough to capture it on canvas. The whispers started small, like ripples in a pond. At first, it was just curious glances when Edward and Bethany had lunch together at the diner. But soon, those ripples grew into waves of gossip that swept through their small town. Bethany noticed it first at the supermarket. The usual stares she got for her size now carried a different edge. Mrs. Thompson, who'd always at least pretended to be polite, now pulled her shopping cart away when Bethany approached the produce section. Two teenage girls giggled behind their hands, their eyes darting between Bethany and the magazine rack she was standing near. Did you hear? One woman loudly whispered to another at the checkout line. That artist boy from the Good Family? Running around with… The rest was lost in meaningful looks and shaking heads. Edward felt it too. His regular customers at the diner started leaving smaller tips. Some stopped coming to his section altogether. His parents' friends would stop him on the street, their voices dripping with fake concern. Such a shame, they'd say. You had such potential. One sunny afternoon, as they walked down Main Street together, a car slowed beside them. The driver rolled down his window and shouted something ugly. Edward instinctively stepped closer to Bethany, his hand finding hers. You okay? He asked softly. Bethany squeezed his hand, her chin lifted high. I'm used to it, she said, but her voice trembled slightly. Though it's different now. Worse, maybe, but also better, because I'm not alone anymore. Later that week, Bethany sat in Edward's studio, looking through a stack of modeling agency applications. Her hands were steady as she filled out each form, but Edward could see the tension in her shoulders. The whole town's talking, she said, not looking up from her papers. They think I'm corrupting you or something. She tried to laugh, but it came out hollow. Edward set down his paintbrush. Let them talk. They don't understand anything about beauty or courage. I got another rejection letter yesterday, Bethany admitted quietly. The agency said they're moving in a different direction. That's code for you don't fit our mold. She straightened the papers with determined movements. But I'm still going to try. Every rejection just makes me want to prove them wrong even more. Edward watched her, amazed by her strength. Even with the weight of an entire town's judgment on her shoulders, even with doors being slammed in her face, she kept going, kept believing, kept fighting. You're the strongest person I know, he said simply. Bethany finally looked up, her eyes shining with unshed tears and determination. Some days I don't feel strong at all, but then I think about all those other girls out there. Girls who look like me, who need to see that it's possible to chase your dreams no matter what anyone says. And that makes me want to keep going. The next day, The Anderson mansion stood like a fortress on the outskirts of town, its manicured lawns and marble columns a testament to old money and older prejudices. Edward hadn't visited his parents in weeks, but the summons from his mother left no room for argument. As he stepped into the formal dining room, the clink of fine china and the stern faces of his parents greeted him. His mother, Margaret Anderson, sat rigid in her high-backed chair, while his father, Richard, stood by the fireplace, swirling brandy in a crystal glass. "Edward, darling," his mother's voice was honey-coated steel. "We need to discuss your recent activities." Edward's stomach tightened. He knew this moment would come, but that didn't make it easier. "Your mother and I have been more than patient," Richard said, setting down his glass with a sharp click. "We've indulged your artistic pursuits, allowed you to work that ridiculous job at the diner. But this latest development is simply unacceptable." "Bethany is not a development," Edward said quietly but firmly. "She's important to me." Margaret's perfectly painted lips thinned. "Dear, you must understand how this looks. The Andersons have a certain position in this community. Your father sits on the hospital board. I chair 3 charity committees. And that matters more than basic human decency?" Edward's voice rose slightly. Richard's face darkened. "Watch your tone, son. We've invested too much in your future to see you throw it all away. The Maxwell girl has been asking about you. Now that would be a suitable match." "I'm not interested in suitable matches," Edward said. "I'm interested in being with someone real, someone who inspires me." "That girl," Margaret's voice dripped with disdain, "is making a spectacle of herself with those modeling ambitions. And now she's dragging you into it." "If you continue this association," Richard added, "we'll have to reconsider your trust fund and the gallery space we promised for your exhibition next spring." The threat hung heavy in the air. Edward felt the weight of generations of expectations pressing down on him. The gallery show had been his dream for years, a chance to finally showcase his art to serious collectors. And the trust fund meant freedom to pursue his artistic career without worry. But in his mind's eye, he saw Bethany's determined smile, her unwavering courage in the face of constant judgment. He thought of his sketches of her, each one capturing not just her physical beauty, but her indomitable spirit. "I won't stop seeing her," Edward said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "If that means I lose the trust fund and the gallery show, then so be it." His mother gasped. His father's face turned red with anger. "Then you leave us no choice," Richard said coldly. "Until you come to your senses, consider yourself cut off." Edward stood up from the table, his legs shaky but his resolve firm. For the first time in his life, he was choosing his own path, regardless of the cost. After a few days, the late afternoon sun painted golden streaks across the town square as Edward led Bethany to the small gazebo where they'd shared so many conversations. His heart pounded against his chest, the small velvet box burning a hole in his pocket. "What's all this about?" Bethany asked, her warm brown eyes twinkling with curiosity. She looked beautiful in her favorite yellow sundress, her dark curls framing her face. Edward took both her hands in his, marveling at how perfectly they fit together. "Bethany, these past few months have changed my life. Before I met you, I was just going through the motions, letting others decide my path." Tears welled up in Bethany's eyes as Edward dropped to one knee. A few passers-by stopped to stare, their whispers carrying across the square. "You showed me what real courage looks like," Edward continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Your strength, your determination, your beautiful heart, they inspire me every single day. I don't care what anyone else thinks. I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life supporting your dreams." With trembling fingers, he pulled out the ring box and opened it, revealing a delicate silver band with a small diamond. It wasn't as fancy as what his family would have expected, but he'd saved up for it himself from his diner wages. "Bethany Williams, will you marry me?" Bethany's hands flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." Edward slipped the ring onto her finger and stood up, pulling her into a tight embrace. Their joy, however, was quickly tempered by the reaction around them. The whispers had grown louder, and disapproving looks came from every direction. Mrs. Peterson, the town gossip, was already on her phone, no doubt spreading the news. Two elderly women walking by shook their heads in obvious disapproval. A group of teenagers snickered and pointed. "Look at them," someone muttered loud enough to be heard. "It's like a circus show." Bethany stiffened in Edward's arms, but he held her tighter. "Hey," he said softly, wiping a tear from her cheek. "It's just you and me right now. Nobody else matters." "The whole town's going to be talking about this," Bethany said, her voice wavering. "Let them talk," Edward replied firmly. "They've been talking since day one, and it hasn't stopped us yet." As they walked hand in hand through the square, the stares and whispers followed them like shadows. Edward could already hear phones buzzing with text messages and see people hurrying into shops to share the latest scandal. The wealthy Anderson boy proposing to the plus-size black girl with impossible dreams. But when Bethany squeezed his hand and smiled up at him, her engagement ring catching the sunlight, Edward felt nothing but certainty. This was right. This was love. And no amount of small-town judgment could change that. The small church was filled with more empty pews than guests on the morning of Edward and Bethany's wedding. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the worn carpet where Edward stood waiting for his bride. The few guests who had come sat scattered throughout the church, their whispers echoing in the hollow space. Most were there out of curiosity rather than celebration, eager to witness what many called the scandal of the year. "Did you hear his parents refused to come?" one woman whispered to another, not bothering to keep her voice down. "Well, what did they expect?" came the reply. "The Andersons have a reputation to maintain." Edward stood tall at the altar, his best friend from art school serving as his best man. Though his heart ached at his parents' empty seats in the front row, he kept his eyes fixed on the church doors, waiting for Bethany. When the music began to play, the whispers grew louder, but all the noise faded away when Bethany appeared in the doorway. She wore a simple white dress that hugged her curves beautifully, her face glowing with joy beneath her veil. Her aunt, the only family member who had supported her through everything, walked her down the aisle. As Bethany made her way forward, someone in the back snickered. Another person made a crude comment about her size. But Bethany kept walking, her head held high, her eyes locked with Edward's. When she reached him, Edward took her hands in his, squeezing them gently. "You're beautiful," he whispered, meaning it with all his heart. The ceremony was short and sweet. The pastor, though clearly uncomfortable, performed his duties professionally. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Edward kissed Bethany tenderly, ignoring the mix of gasps and judgmental clicks of tongues from the audience. At the small reception in the church basement, most guests kept their distance from the newlyweds, clustering in corners to gossip. The space felt even emptier without Edward's family present. No parents to give speeches, no siblings to share childhood stories. But as Edward and Bethany shared their first dance, swaying gently to the music playing from a borrowed speaker, none of that seemed to matter. Bethany rested her head on Edward's shoulder, and he held her close. "I wish your parents had come," Bethany whispered. "You're my family now," Edward replied, his voice firm and loving. "That's all that matters." They danced slowly in the center of the room, surrounded by judgmental stares and disapproving murmurs, but wrapped in their own world of love and commitment. The harsh fluorescent lights of the church basement couldn't dim the joy in their eyes or the genuine smiles on their faces. This wasn't the fancy wedding his parents had always imagined for him, with hundreds of guests and expensive decorations. It wasn't the dream ceremony Bethany had once hoped for either. But as they held each other close, both knew that this moment, this honest, imperfect, beautiful moment, was exactly right for them. The morning after their wedding, Bethany woke up next to Edward in their small apartment above Main Street. Sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, casting a warm glow on his peaceful face. For a moment, everything felt perfect. But reality came crashing back when they stepped out for breakfast at the local diner. The whispers started as soon as they walked in. Bethany's hand tightened around Edward's as several customers turned to stare. "There goes the artist and his wife," someone muttered, the pause before wife loaded with judgment. The waitress, who had known Edward for years, barely looked at them as she took their order. Her usual friendly demeanor had vanished, replaced by cold efficiency. "Maybe we should have gone somewhere else," Bethany said quietly, pushing her eggs around her plate. "This is our town too," Edward replied, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "We have nothing to be ashamed of." But the shame crept in anyway, unwanted and persistent. At the grocery store, mothers pulled their children closer when Bethany passed by. At the park, people got up and moved when she and Edward sat down on a bench. Each day brought new challenges. Walking down the street, Bethany heard the whispers, "Who does she think she is? And he could do so much better." The words stung, even though she tried to ignore them. Edward noticed how Bethany's shoulders would tense up whenever they went out together, how her bright smile would dim slightly when another person crossed the street to avoid them. He saw how she spent more time in front of the mirror, scrutinizing herself with worried eyes. "You're beautiful," he would tell her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Don't let them make you doubt that." But doubt had a way of seeping in through the cracks. One afternoon, Bethany came home from a modeling application in tears. The agency had been polite but dismissive. "They didn't even look at my portfolio," she sobbed into Edward's chest. "They just saw me and made up their minds right there." Edward held her close, feeling helpless against the wave of cruelty that seemed to surround them. He noticed how Bethany's usual confidence wavered, how she second-guessed herself more often. The town's judgment was wearing her down, chip by chip. Still, Edward remained her rock. Each morning he left little sketches for her to find, drawings of her smiling, laughing, being herself. When people stared at them in restaurants, he would hold her hand tighter and talk louder about their plans and dreams. When neighbors whispered, he would kiss her in plain sight, proud to show his love. But even Edward couldn't shield her from everything. The strain showed in the dark circles under his eyes, in the way his jaw clenched whenever someone made a rude comment. He tried to hide it from Bethany, but she noticed how he worked longer hours at the diner, how his normally steady hand sometimes shook with suppressed anger. Their love remained strong, but the weight of constant judgment pressed down on them both, testing their resilience day after day. Edward's hands trembled as he held the letter from his parents. The expensive cream-colored paper felt heavy in his grip, its elegant script delivering a message that made his stomach churn. "What is it?" Bethany asked, noticing his pale face from across their tiny kitchen table. Edward read the words again, each one hitting him like a physical blow. His parents had made their position crystal clear. Either he ended his foolish support of Bethany's modeling aspirations and convinced her to settle into a more appropriate lifestyle, or they would cut him off completely. No inheritance, no family connections, no safety net. "They can't stand that I'm happy with you," he said softly, looking up at his wife. "They want me to make you give up your dreams." Bethany's face fell, her fork clattering against her plate. "Oh, they're threatening to cut me off completely." Edward's voice cracked. "No more financial support, no family connections. They'll pretend I don't exist." The weight of his parents' ultimatum hung heavy in the air between them. Edward thought about all the things his family's money had made possible: their apartment's security deposit, the art supplies he used to create his pieces, the emergency fund that gave them peace of mind. "Maybe," Bethany started, her voice small. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I should just—" "No," Edward interrupted, reaching across the table to grasp her hands. "Don't even say it." Tears welled up in Bethany's eyes. "But Edward, they're your family. And without their support—" "You're my family now," Edward said firmly, though his voice shook. He looked down at the letter again, at his mother's elegant handwriting that somehow managed to convey both love and threat at once. The deadline they'd given him, 1 week to come to his senses, seemed to mock him from the page. Edward stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked to the window, staring out at the town that had shown them so little kindness. His parents' ultimatum wasn't just about money. It was about choosing between the comfortable, accepted life they wanted for him and the authentic, challenging life he'd chosen with Bethany. "They think they can control me with money," he said, his voice growing stronger. "They think they can force me to make you give up your dreams." He turned back to Bethany, his eyes fierce with determination. "But they're wrong." Bethany sat very still, watching him with worried eyes. "Edward, that's your whole future they're threatening. Your inheritance, your safety net, your family." "My future is with you," Edward said, crumpling the letter in his fist. "And I choose you. I choose us." Edward tore the letter into tiny pieces, letting them fall into the trash can like expensive confetti. His hands were steady now, his decision made. The weight of choosing Bethany over his family's wealth and approval settled on his shoulders. Heavy, but somehow freeing. News of Edward's choice spread through the small town like wildfire. At the diner where he still worked, conversations would halt when he walked by, only to resume in hushed, judgmental whispers. "Threw away everything for her," they'd say. "His poor parents, such a disappointment." Bethany felt the increased scrutiny everywhere she went. The grocery store clerk's smirk seemed more pointed, the sideways glances more obvious. Even the usual mockery of her modeling dreams took on a sharper edge. "Look who it is," a woman loudly whispered to her friend as Bethany walked past the beauty salon. "The girl who made Edward Anderson throw away his inheritance. Guess she thinks she's really something special now." Edward's parents' reaction sent shockwaves through their social circle. They removed his photo from their mantle, his name from their country club membership, and publicly announced their disappointment in their only son's choices. The town's elite, who had once welcomed Edward warmly, now turned their backs when they saw him coming. At church on Sunday, the couple sat alone in their usual pew, surrounded by empty spaces where people used to sit. The pastor's sermon about honoring one's parents felt pointed, and several congregation members nodded meaningfully in their direction. "Did you hear?" became the common opener at social gatherings. Edward Anderson chose that girl over his whole family fortune, and she's still pursuing that ridiculous modeling dream of hers. The daily jeers grew bolder. Notes appeared on their car windshield, crude messages about gold diggers and family betrayal. Someone spray-painted "Fool" across Edward's parking spot at the diner. Through it all, Edward held Bethany's hand tighter. Each morning, as they faced another day of sideways glances and whispered judgments, he would kiss her forehead and say, "I'd choose you again." Every single time. The cruelty of the town's reaction only strengthened their bond. When Bethany would come home crying after another day of increased mockery, Edward would pull out his sketchbook and show her how he saw her, strong, beautiful, unstoppable. His art became their shelter from the storm of judgment that raged around them. "They can take away my inheritance," Edward said one evening, as they sat in their small living room, the sound of jeering teenagers passing by their window. "They can take away my family name, my connections, everything. But they can't take away what matters most. My love for you and my belief in your dreams." One evening, as Bethany stood in front of their bedroom mirror, practicing her runway walk for the 100th time that evening, her shoulders were pulled back, chin lifted high, despite the weight of the town's judgment pressing down on her. The prestigious Fuller Figure Fashion Week competition was just 2 months away, and she was determined to make her mark. "You've got this," Edward said softly from where he sat sketching at their small desk. "Your walk is getting stronger every day." Bethany paused, catching her breath. "I hear them, you know. At the grocery store yesterday, Mrs. Peterson told everyone within earshot that I'm the reason you'll never amount to anything." Her voice cracked slightly. "That I'm dragging you down." Edward set his sketchbook aside and crossed the room to her. "Hey, look at me. Their words don't define us." Bethany nodded, wiping away a tear before it could fall. She couldn't afford to let her makeup run. She had to practice with full competition makeup, even though the expensive cosmetics stretched their already tight budget. Every morning, Bethany woke up at 5 to practice her walking and poses before heading to her job at the local department store. During lunch breaks, she studied videos of successful plus-size models on her phone, taking notes and mimicking their movements. After work, she spent hours rehearsing her runway walk in their small living room, using masking tape on the floor to mark out proper dimensions. Edward helped however he could. He took extra shifts at the diner to help pay for her competition entry fee. He photographed her practice sessions, helping her analyze her poses and movements. Most importantly, he believed in her when it seemed like the entire world was betting against her. "Remember what Naomi Campbell said," Bethany muttered to herself as she resumed her practice. "I don't get out of bed for less than $10,000 a day." She laughed softly. Right now, I'd settle for getting out of this town. The training was rigorous. Bethany's feet ached from hours of practicing in heels. Her muscles burned from maintaining perfect posture. But every time she felt like giving up, she thought about the little girls who looked like her, who needed to see someone break through these barriers. "Your turn is smoother now," Edward observed, making quick sketches of her movements. "You're really getting that signature stride down." Bethany smiled, but her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. The competition entry fee had taken most of their savings, leaving little for proper training resources. She relied on YouTube tutorials and free online workshops, studying late into the night after her practice sessions. "I just hope it's enough," she whispered, more to herself than to Edward. "Sometimes I wonder if they're right, if I'm just fooling myself." Edward stood up and wrapped his arms around her. "You're not fooling anyone. You're showing them what courage looks like, what determination looks like." He gestured to the wall where he'd hung his favorite sketches of her. "That's who you are. That's what they can't see, but the judges will." Bethany took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and resumed her practice. With each step, she worked to prove that their sacrifice, Edward's sacrifice, wouldn't be in vain. She would make this dream real, not just for herself, but for both of them. The rumors started like a whisper, barely noticeable at first. Marcus, Edward's former best friend since childhood, had been silently seething ever since Edward chose Bethany over his family's wealth and status. Now his resentment had finally boiled over. It began with subtle comments at the country club where Marcus still maintained his membership. "You know, I heard she's just using Edward," he would say casually over drinks. "She's probably after what's left of his trust fund to finance her modeling career." He'd say the word modeling with a slight sneer that made others lean in closer, eager for more gossip. When Bethany walked into the department store for her morning shift, she noticed the strange looks from her coworkers. The whispers stopped abruptly when she approached. During her lunch break, she overheard two colleagues discussing how she had trapped Edward, supposedly desperate for his money to fund her competition dreams. "I heard she's been lying about everything," one whispered. "Marcus says she never even submitted her application to the modeling competition. She's just pretending, taking Edward's money." The rumors spread quickly through the small town, gaining momentum with each retelling. Marcus, with his polished appearance and family connections, made his accusations seem credible. He played on the town's existing prejudices, carefully crafting a narrative that painted Bethany as a manipulative gold digger. Edward confronted Marcus outside the diner one afternoon, his hands trembling with anger. "Why are you doing this? You were my best friend." Marcus adjusted his expensive tie, looking down at Edward's work uniform with disdain. "I'm trying to save you from yourself, Ed. Look at what she's done to you, working double shifts at this dump, cut off from your family. This isn't you." "You don't know me anymore," Edward replied, his voice tight with emotion. "And you certainly don't know Bethany." Marcus's face hardened. "I know enough. You threw away everything, your future, your family's respect, our friendship. For what? So she can play at being a model? Wake up, Ed. She's using you, and I'm not going to stand by and watch you destroy yourself." The confrontation left Edward shaken, but it was Bethany who bore the brunt of Marcus's campaign. Her modeling dreams, once a source of hope, were now being twisted into something ugly and false. Each day brought new whispers, new accusations, new doubts planted in the minds of those around them. The rumors threatened to undermine everything Bethany had worked for, casting shadows on her integrity, just as she prepared for the biggest opportunity of her life. But what hurt most was seeing how Marcus's words affected Edward, forcing him to defend their relationship to people who had once been his closest friends. The day of the modeling competition arrived with a heavy weight of anticipation. Bethany stood backstage at the Riverside Convention Center, her heart pounding as she adjusted her emerald green dress. Edward had helped her pick it out, saving for weeks to afford the perfect outfit. Around her, other contestants chatted and laughed, their confidence filling the space. As Bethany waited for her turn, she couldn't help but notice the whispers and pointed looks from some of the other contestants. One of them held up her phone, showing something to her friends before they all turned to stare at Bethany with poorly concealed smirks. The head judge, Miranda Wells, a former supermodel known for launching successful careers, sat at the center of the judging panel. When Bethany stepped onto the runway, she held her head high, just as she'd practiced countless times in front of her mirror at home. The lights felt warm on her skin as she began her walk. Before she could complete her first turn, Miranda's voice cut through the air. "Stop, please!" The words sliced through the room like a knife. "This isn't working." Bethany froze mid-stride, her confident pose faltering. Miranda adjusted her glasses and looked down at some papers in front of her. "Miss Santos, while I appreciate what you're trying to do here, this competition isn't meant to be some sort of activist's whim. We're looking for professional models, not social statements." The room fell silent. Bethany felt every eye on her, burning with judgment or pity. She couldn't tell which was worse. Her chest tightened as she struggled to maintain her composure. "But I am a real contender," Bethany managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Miranda's lips curved into a patronizing smile. "Dear, the industry has certain standards. We can't just change them because someone wants to make a point. This isn't that kind of platform." The words hit Bethany like physical blows. All those rumors Marcus had spread, all the doubts people had voiced about her dreams being nothing but a desperate grab for attention, they all seemed to crystallize in Miranda's dismissal. Bethany's legs felt weak as she left the stage. In the wings, she caught snippets of whispered conversations. "Did you see the article about her? I heard she's just doing this for attention. Apparently, she convinced some rich guy to fund her delusions." The makeup she'd applied so carefully that morning felt heavy on her face, and tears threatened to ruin it completely. She fumbled with her phone, her trembling fingers finding Edward's number, but then stopped. For the first time since they'd been together, she felt ashamed to call him. Ashamed that maybe everyone had been right about her all along. In the bathroom, Bethany stared at her reflection, Miranda's words echoing in her mind. "Not a real contender." The phrase repeated itself, mixing with every doubtful comment she'd ever heard, every snicker, every whispered judgment. The confidence she'd worked so hard to build seemed to crumble, leaving behind a raw, aching vulnerability that threatened to overwhelm her. In the days following the competition, Bethany moved through her daily routines like a shadow of her former self. The sparkle that once lit up her eyes had dimmed, replaced by a distant, haunted look. She spent more time in front of their bedroom mirror, pinching at parts of herself she'd once celebrated, her lips pressed into a tight line. Edward noticed the change immediately. Where Bethany had once filled their small house with animated stories and dreams of future modeling shoots, now silence stretched between them like a growing chasm. At dinner, she pushed food around her plate, lost in thought. "The pasta's your favorite," Edward said softly one evening, watching his wife stare blankly at her untouched meal. "I'm not very hungry," Bethany mumbled, her voice flat. She stood up, carrying her full plate to the sink. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I've been fooling myself all along." Edward's heart clenched at her words. "Beth, you can't let them..." "Can't let them what, Edward?" Bethany's voice cracked. "Tell me the truth? That I don't belong in that world? That I'm just making a fool of myself?" She gripped the edge of the sink, her knuckles turning white. "Everyone sees it, your parents saw it, the whole town sees it, even professional judges see it." When Edward tried to approach her, Bethany stepped away. The small gesture felt like a physical blow. He watched helplessly as she retreated to their bedroom, closing the door softly behind her. The pattern continued for days. Bethany stopped wearing the bright colors she loved, choosing instead to wrap herself in dark, shapeless clothes. She declined invitations to go out, even to their favorite diner where they'd first met. The modeling magazines that used to litter their coffee table disappeared into a box in the closet. Each morning, Edward would find little notes she'd written to herself crumpled in the trash. Stop dreaming impossible dreams, and know your place. These scattered pieces of paper told the story of Bethany's crumbling confidence more clearly than any words she spoke aloud. One afternoon, Edward came home early from work to find Bethany taking down the photos of herself that he'd hung on their walls, beautiful portraits he'd painted of her smiling, confident, and radiant. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. "I can't look at them anymore," Bethany whispered, her hands trembling as she removed another frame. "They're not real, Edward. They're just pretty lies you painted to make me feel better about myself." Edward watched as the woman he loved, who had once stood so tall against the world's judgment, seemed to fold in on herself, becoming smaller with each passing day. The fire that had drawn him to her, that had inspired his art and changed his life, was flickering dangerously low, threatened by the harsh winds of reality and cruel words that had finally found their mark. Next day, Edward sat at his easel in their small home studio, staring at his latest painting of Bethany. In it, she stood tall and proud, her curves celebrated in a flowing red dress, her smile radiating confidence. The contrast between the woman in the painting and his wife's current state made his chest ache. He found Bethany in their bedroom, folding laundry with mechanical movements. "Beth," he said softly, "would you come with me for a minute?" She paused, then shook her head. "I need to finish this." "Please?" He held out his hand. "Just for a moment." Bethany followed him reluctantly to his studio. When she saw the painting, she turned away. "Edward, don't." "Look at it," he insisted gently. "This is who you are. This is the woman I fell in love with." "That's not me anymore." Bethany's voice was barely a whisper. That woman was living in a fantasy. Edward stepped closer, but Bethany moved away. "You're wrong. That woman is real. She's strong, beautiful, and brave." "Stop it." Bethany wrapped her arms around herself. "Look at what loving me has cost you. Your family, your reputation, everything." "I haven't lost anything that matters," Edward said firmly. "Haven't you?" Bethany's eyes filled with tears. "Your parents won't speak to you. People whisper when you walk by. The diner's losing customers because you married me. You could have had such a different life." "I don't want a different life." "Maybe you should." Bethany's words hung heavy in the air. "Maybe everyone's right. Maybe I'm just dragging you down with my silly dreams." Edward reached for her hand, but she pulled away again. The small rejection felt like a knife in his heart. "I need some time alone," Bethany said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm going to stay with my sister for a few days." "Beth, please." "I need to think, Edward, about us, about everything." She wiped at her eyes. "You deserve better than being tied to someone who can't even face herself in the mirror anymore." Edward watched helplessly as Bethany left the studio, her shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. The sound of their bedroom door closing echoed through the house, leaving him alone with his paintings of a woman who seemed to be slipping away more each day. The distance between them grew, not just in physical space, but in the silence of unanswered texts and brief, stilted phone calls. Each time Edward reached out, Bethany's responses became shorter, more detached. She was building walls brick by brick, convinced she was protecting him by pushing him away. The morning sun cast long shadows across their bedroom as Bethany packed her suitcase. Her hands trembled as she folded each piece of clothing, tears falling silently onto the fabric. Through blurry eyes, she glanced at the photos on their dresser, happy moments that now felt like they belonged to someone else. Edward stood in the doorway, his artist's hands gripping the frame so tight his knuckles turned white. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice cracking. "I do." Bethany couldn't look at him. "Everyone was right about me, Edward. I'm just a dreamer who dragged you into my mess." "That's not true." Edward took a step forward. "You're the strongest person I know." Bethany zipped up her suitcase, the sound feeling final and harsh. Strong people don't destroy the lives of those they love. She finally turned to face him, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. Look at what loving me has done to you. No more fancy art galleries, no family support, no respect in town. I chose this, I chose you, Edward insisted, reaching for her hand. Bethany pulled away, the distance between them growing wider with each passing second. And that's exactly why I have to go. You deserve your life back, Edward. Your real life, not this struggle you've been living because of me. She picked up her suitcase, its weight nothing compared to the heaviness in her heart. I've already signed the separation papers. They're on the kitchen table. Edward's face crumpled. Beth, please, we can fight this together. No, she whispered, shaking her head. I need to stop fighting. Stop pretending I can be something I'm not. She walked past him, her shoulder brushing his as she moved through the doorway. I'm setting you free. Edward followed her to the front door, his steps urgent and desperate. You're everything to me. Your dreams, your strength. They're part of who I am now. Bethany paused at the door, her hand on the knob. Maybe that's the problem. You need to find yourself again without me holding you back. She opened the door, stepping into the morning light. Goodbye, Edward. As she walked to her car, Edward stood frozen in the doorway, watching the love of his life slip away. His heart screamed to run after her, but he knew that right now she wouldn't listen. Instead, he whispered to himself, This isn't over, Beth. I'll find a way to help you see what I see. The sound of Bethany's car starting up cut through the quiet morning. Edward watched as she drove away, taking his heart with her, but leaving him with an iron determination to help her rediscover her worth. Days melted into one another as Bethany settled into her small apartment on the other side of town. The walls were bare, and the silence was deafening compared to the warmth of the home she'd shared with Edward. She threw herself into her work at the local library, finding solace in organizing books and helping visitors, simple tasks that required no dreams, no ambition. Every morning she avoided looking at herself in the mirror for too long. The woman who once dreamed of gracing magazine covers now wore shapeless cardigans and kept her head down. It was easier this way, she told herself, even as her heart ached with each passing day. One Tuesday afternoon during her lunch break, Bethany's phone buzzed with an unusual number of notifications. Confused, she opened her social media app to find her inbox flooded with messages of support. Her hands shaking, she scrolled through until she found the source. A popular body-positive influencer had shared her story. There, in a lengthy post that had already garnered thousands of likes, was a photo someone had taken of her at the modeling competition. The influencer had written, "Meet Bethany Sampson, a woman who dared to dream in a world that tried to keep her small. Her story of pursuing plus-size modeling in the face of small-town prejudice isn't just inspiring. It's a reminder that beauty has no size limit and courage knows no bounds." Tears welled up in Bethany's eyes as she read comment after comment. "You're absolutely gorgeous. Don't let anyone dim your light. This is the representation we need. Where can we follow her journey?" Her phone continued to buzz with notifications. Messages poured in from women around the country sharing their own stories of struggle and resilience. Some sent photos of themselves, proud in their own skin, thanking her for giving them courage. Others shared their own experiences with small-town judgment and prejudice. Bethany sat in the library's break room, her sandwich forgotten, as she realized that her story, the very thing she'd been trying to hide from, had touched people she'd never met. These strangers saw in her what Edward had always seen: strength, beauty, and the power of refusing to be diminished by others' limitations. Her hands trembled as she read a message from a young black girl. "I've never seen anyone who looks like me trying to be a model in my small town. Thank you for showing me it's possible to dream big." The weight of regret pressed heavily on her chest. In trying to protect Edward, had she also given up on all the people who needed to see someone like her succeed? The thought made her breath catch in her throat. She'd been so focused on the voices telling her to be less, she'd forgotten about all the voices waiting for someone to show them how to be more. Edward sat in his studio surrounded by dozens of paintings of Bethany. Each canvas captured a different moment, a different emotion. Her confident smile at the diner, her determined look before the competition, the gentle way she'd touch his hand when he was worried. The morning light streamed through the windows, making the still wet paint glisten on his latest work. His phone rang. It was his mother calling for the third time that week. This time, instead of letting it go to voicemail, he answered. "Edward, darling, we need to talk about your future." His mother's voice dripped with fake sweetness. "Your father and I have discussed it, and we're willing to welcome you back if you'll just be reasonable about certain choices." Edward looked at the painting before him. Bethany's eyes held such strength, even in paint. "No, Mother. I need to say something." His voice was quiet, but firm. "I've spent my whole life trying to be the son you wanted, but Bethany showed me what real courage looks like." "Don't be ridiculous," his mother started. "I'm not finished," Edward interrupted, surprising himself with his steadiness. "Your money, your social circles, your approval, none of it matters if I have to hide who I really am. I choose to be true to myself, just like Bethany taught me." After ending the call, Edward drove to his former best friend Marcus's house. Marcus had been the source of many rumors about Bethany, and it was time to address it. Marcus opened the door with his usual smirk. "Finally came to your senses?" "Actually, yes," Edward replied, standing straight. "I've been senseless letting you spread lies about Bethany. It stops now." "Come on, man, I was trying to help you save face." "No," Edward cut him off. "You were being cruel because you couldn't understand something beautiful and different. We're done." Back in his studio, Edward felt lighter. He picked up his brush and began working on a new piece. This time, painting Bethany as he'd first seen her, radiant with determination and hope. His hand moved with certainty, each stroke deliberate and true. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across his workspace as he stepped back to look at his work. For the first time since Bethany left, he felt at peace with his choices. He'd chosen love over prejudice, truth over comfort, and in doing so, he'd finally become the person he was meant to be. Bethany's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. She stared at the screen, her hands trembling as notification after notification poured in. The post about her story had somehow caught fire overnight, with thousands of shares and comments flooding her social media accounts. "You're an inspiration. Keep fighting. We need more women like you in the industry." Tears welled up in her eyes as she scrolled through the messages. After months of hiding away, working her retail job and trying to convince herself that giving up had been the right choice, the world seemed to be reaching out with open arms. Then came the email that made her heart stop. "Dear Bethany," she read aloud, her voice barely a whisper in her small apartment. "We are Curves and Grace, a leading inclusive fashion brand, and your story has deeply moved us. Your resilience and authenticity represent everything our brand stands for." Bethany had to sit down, her legs weak. Curves and Grace was one of the biggest names in plus-size fashion. She'd spent countless hours admiring their campaigns, dreaming of seeing herself in their advertisements. "We would be honored to have you as the face of our upcoming spring campaign." The words blurred as tears dropped onto her phone screen. This was everything she'd ever wanted, everything she'd fought for, everything she'd eventually convinced herself she didn't deserve. Her phone rang, displaying an unfamiliar number with a New York area code. With shaking fingers, she answered. "Hello, is this Bethany Santos?" A warm, professional voice asked. "Yes, this is she," Bethany managed to reply, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm Sandra Martinez, creative director at Curves and Grace. I trust you've received our email?" Yes, I have," Bethany said, wiping her eyes. I don't know what to say." "Your story resonated with so many people, Bethany. The authenticity, the struggle, the determination, that's exactly what our brand represents. We don't just want models. We want real women with real stories who can inspire others." Bethany looked at herself in the mirror across the room. The woman who stared back wasn't the same person who'd walked away from her dreams months ago. This woman's eyes held hope again. The campaign would involve a 2-week shoot in New York, Sandra continued. We'd love to have you come up next week to discuss the details in person. Bethany's heart raced. New York, a real campaign. A chance to be the kind of model she'd always dreamed of being. One who could show other women that beauty didn't come in just one size or color. Would you be interested? Sandra asked after Bethany's prolonged silence. Bethany took a deep breath, remembering all the times she'd been told she was too big, too dark, too different. She thought of every snicker, every whisper, every judgment. But she also thought of Edward, who had seen her beauty when she couldn't see it herself. Yes, Bethany said, her voice growing stronger. Yes, I would be very interested. Edward stood outside Bethany's apartment building, his heart pounding. In his hands, he clutched a small portfolio of his latest paintings. All of her, each one capturing a different facet of her strength and beauty. Taking a deep breath, he pressed the buzzer. When Bethany opened the door, her eyes widened. They stood in silence for a moment, the air heavy with unspoken words. I heard about Curves and Grace, Edward said softly. I always knew you could do it. Bethany's eyes welled with tears. Edward, I'm so sorry. I thought I was protecting you by leaving, but I was wrong. You never needed to protect me, he replied, his voice gentle. We protect each other. That's what love is. He opened his portfolio, showing her the paintings he'd created during their separation. Each piece captured her essence, her determined smile, the proud set of her shoulders, the light in her eyes that no amount of criticism could dim. You're still painting me, she whispered, touching one of the canvases. I never stopped seeing you, Edward said. And I want everyone else to see you too. I've rented space at the Mason Street Gallery. I want to show these paintings. Show them who you really are. Bethany looked up at him, her heart full. Come home, Edward said simply, holding out his hand. That evening, Bethany walked through their front door for the first time in months. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. Her favorite throw blanket still draped over the couch, her coffee mug still in its special spot by the kitchen window. 2 weeks later, the Mason Street Gallery buzzed with activity. Edward's paintings of Bethany lined the walls, powerful, beautiful portraits that showed her radiance, her determination, her joy. The same townspeople who had once whispered behind their hands now stood in awe before the artwork. These are extraordinary, one woman murmured, studying a painting of Bethany, laughing, her head thrown back in pure joy. The strength in her eyes, another patron commented, standing before a portrait where Bethany's gaze seemed to pierce right through the canvas. Bethany moved through the crowd, her hand in Edward's, her head held high. She could feel the shift in the room. The whispers were no longer cruel but admiring. Edward's art had transformed their judgment into understanding. You did this, she whispered to Edward, squeezing his hand. No, he replied, looking at her with pride. You did this. I just showed them what was always there. The exhibition became the talk of the town, but for entirely different reasons than before. People who had once mocked Bethany's dreams now spoke of her upcoming Curves and Grace campaign with respect. Edward's paintings had done more than showcase her beauty. They had revealed her humanity, her dignity, her worth. Standing in the gallery, surrounded by Edward's loving vision of her, Bethany felt her confidence surge back stronger than ever. She was ready for New York, ready for the campaign, ready for everything that lay ahead. And this time she knew she didn't have to face it alone. Bethany sat at her vanity, reading the official contract from Curves and Grace for the 10th time. Her fingers traced over the words, "Runway Debut," as a smile spread across her face. Edward watched from the doorway, beaming with pride. I want to invite everyone, Bethany announced suddenly, looking up at Edward through the mirror. The whole town. Edward's eyebrows rose. Everyone, are you sure? Even Mrs. Peterson, who said I'd never make it. Even your old friend who spread those rumors. Bethany's voice was steady, determined. I want them all to see what happens when you believe in yourself. The next morning, Bethany walked down Main Street with her head held high, delivering invitations to the fashion show. She stopped at the diner where she and Edward first met, handing an invitation to the owner who had always rolled her eyes at Bethany's dreams. "I'd be honored if you could attend," Bethany said warmly, watching the woman's surprised expression. At the local salon where the gossip about her had often been the loudest, Bethany handed out invitations to the stunned stylists. "Front row seats," she said with a genuine smile. "I want you to have the best view." Some people accepted the invitations with shame-faced mumbles, others with genuine congratulations. A few tried to act as if they had always supported her. Bethany took it all in stride, her confidence growing with each step. Back home, Edward helped her prepare for the show. They transformed their living room into a makeshift runway, and Bethany practiced her walk while Edward offered encouragement and feedback. The local newspaper, which had once printed snide comments about her ambitions, now requested an interview. "What made you decide to invite your critics?" the reporter asked, pencil poised. Bethany thought for a moment. "Because success isn't about proving people wrong," she replied. "It's about showing them what's possible when you refuse to let fear win." As the day of the show approached, Bethany received RSVPs from almost everyone she'd invited. Even Mrs. Peterson, who had been one of her harshest critics, sent a note saying she would attend. In the final fitting session at Curves and Grace's studio, Bethany stood before the mirror in her runway outfit, a stunning evening gown that hugged her curves perfectly. The designer adjusted the fabric, praising how well Bethany carried the dress. "Are you nervous about facing your hometown crowd?" the designer asked. Bethany smoothed her hands over the sparkling fabric. "No," she said, and meant it. "I'm excited to share this moment with them. Every single one of them is part of my story, even the ones who didn't believe in me. Especially them." Edward squeezed her hand. "You're going to change minds out there." "I already have," Bethany replied, thinking of the shifted attitudes in town, the way former critics now smiled at her on the street. "But more importantly, I changed my own mind about what I deserve, and that's worth sharing with everyone." The morning of the runway show dawned bright and clear. Bethany stood backstage at the grand venue, her heart beating like a drum against her ribs. Around her, makeup artists and hairstylists buzzed with activity, preparing her and the other models for their big moment. Through a gap in the curtain, she could see the seats filling up with familiar faces from home. There was Mrs. Peterson in her Sunday best, clutching her purse tightly. The diner owner sat nearby, looking uncomfortable in her fancy clothes. Row by row, the small-town critics who had once dismissed Bethany's dreams took their places. In the front row, Edward sat straight and proud, his artist's portfolio in his lap. He had brought his latest painting of Bethany, a stunning portrait that captured her radiant smile and confident pose. His parents' seats remained empty, but he barely noticed their absence anymore. The designer from Curves and Grace made last-minute adjustments to Bethany's first outfit, a flowing emerald evening gown that sparkled under the lights. "You were born for this moment," she whispered to Bethany, squeezing her shoulder. The lights dimmed and the music began. Bethany's hands trembled slightly as she took her place in line. She could hear the murmur of the crowd beyond the curtain, the shuffling of programs, the occasional cough that seemed to echo in the charged atmosphere. When her turn came, Bethany took a deep breath and stepped onto the runway. The bright lights washed over her like a warm embrace. She lifted her chin and let her smile shine, remembering all the times she had practiced in her living room with Edward cheering her on. The audience fell silent. Eyes that had once held judgment now widened in amazement. Mrs. Peterson's mouth fell open slightly, her critical expression melting into one of wonder. The diner owner leaned forward in her seat, transfixed. Bethany glided down the runway with grace and confidence, her curves moving elegantly in the shimmering fabric. Each step felt like a victory, each pose a declaration of her worth. The photographer's cameras clicked rapidly, capturing every moment of her triumph. Edward beamed from his front row seat, tears of joy and pride glistening in his eyes. He watched as his wife commanded the runway, her presence so powerful that even the fashion critics were scribbling furiously in their notebooks. When Bethany reached the end of the runway, she paused, striking a pose that radiated confidence and joy. The same people who had once whispered behind her back now sat speechless, witnessing the transformation of the woman they had underestimated for so long. The applause started slowly, then built to a thunderous roar. Edward was the first to stand, his face glowing with pride, and soon the entire audience followed suit. Even Mrs. Peterson rose to her feet, clapping with genuine enthusiasm. Bethany's heart soared as she made her way back down the runway, her head held high. In that moment, she wasn't just walking for herself. She was walking for every person who had ever been told their dreams were too big, their bodies wrong, their goals impossible. The lights caught the tears of joy glistening in her eyes as she reached the end of the runway, but her smile never wavered. She had done it. She had shown them all what was possible when you believed in yourself. The applause continued to thunder through the venue as Bethany completed her final walk. Tears of joy streamed down her face, catching the spotlight and making her glow even more radiantly. The standing ovation seemed to stretch on forever, with whistles and cheers joining the thunderous clapping. In the third row, Mrs. Thompson, who had once told Bethany to stop living in a fantasy world, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. The diner regulars who used to snicker behind their coffee cups now stood in awe, their faces showing a mix of shame and newfound respect. "She's magnificent," whispered one of the town council members to his wife. Who would have thought? Hidden in the back of the venue, partially concealed by a column, stood Edward's parents. His mother gripped his father's arm tightly, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his sleeve. They had come unannounced, drawn by curiosity and the growing buzz around Bethany's debut. Mrs. Anderson's lips trembled as she watched her daughter-in-law command the runway. The pride she saw in Edward's face as he applauded from the front row made her heart ache with regret. She remembered all the harsh words she had spoken, all the times she had dismissed Bethany as unsuitable. "We were wrong, weren't we?" she whispered to her husband, her voice barely audible above the continuing applause. Mr. Anderson nodded slowly, his usual stern expression softening as he watched Bethany's triumphant moment. The success and confidence radiating from the runway made their previous objections seem small and petty. The townspeople who had gathered for the show began turning to each other, their expressions transformed. The local newspaper editor, who had once refused to cover Bethany's modeling aspirations, was now frantically taking notes. The baker who used to roll her eyes whenever Bethany entered her shop stood misty-eyed, clapping until her hands hurt. Edward remained standing, his heart swelling with love and pride. He held his portfolio close to his chest, filled with the paintings that had captured Bethany's beauty long before the rest of the world could see it. The tears in his eyes blurred his vision, but he couldn't stop smiling as the audience continued to shower his wife with appreciation and respect. The applause echoed through the venue, drowning out years of whispers and judgment. In that moment, the small town's perception shifted, and those who had doubted Bethany the most now stood among her loudest supporters. Backstage, away from the thunderous applause and bright lights, Bethany stood trembling in front of a full-length mirror. Her runway makeup was slightly smudged from happy tears, but her smile radiated pure joy. The sequins on her final outfit caught the softer backstage lighting, creating tiny dancing spots on the walls around her. She heard familiar footsteps approaching and saw Edward's reflection appear behind her in the mirror. Their eyes met in the reflection, and for a moment, neither spoke. The weight of their journey, every tear, every struggle, every moment of doubt hung in the air between them. "You did it," Edward whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You showed them all." Bethany turned to face him, her hands shaking as she reached for his. "We did it," she corrected him softly. "I wouldn't be here without you, Edward, without your belief in me when I couldn't believe in myself." Edward gently wiped a tear from her cheek, careful not to smudge her makeup further. "Do you remember that first day at the diner, when I couldn't stop sketching you? I thought you were just another person staring at me," Bethany admitted with a small laugh. "I never imagined you were seeing what nobody else could see." Edward pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her waist. "I saw you exactly as you are, beautiful, strong, unstoppable, even when you left." "Don't," Bethany interrupted, placing her fingers against his lips. "That was my biggest mistake, thinking I was protecting you by leaving." I was so wrong." "But you came back," Edward said, taking her hand and kissing her fingers. "We're stronger now because we fought for this. For us." Bethany leaned her forehead against his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with paint. "Remember all those nights you stayed up with me, practicing my walk in our tiny living room? You knocked over my easel twice," Edward chuckled, the sound rumbling in his chest. "3 times, Bethany corrected with a giggle. "The 3rd time was when your parents showed up unannounced." The mention of his parents would have once brought tension, but now they both smiled at the memory. Their love had weathered that storm, growing deeper roots through every challenge they faced. "I wouldn't change any of it," Edward said softly, lifting her chin so their eyes met. "Every struggle brought us here. Every person who doubted us made us fight harder." Tears welled up in Bethany's eyes again as she looked at her husband, her champion, her artist, her rock. "Thank you for never giving up on me, even when I gave up on myself." Edward's own eyes glistened as he held her face in his hands. "Thank you for showing me what real courage looks like, for teaching me that love is worth fighting for." They stood there in the quiet backstage area, holding each other close, their hearts beating in sync. The sounds of the crowd still filtered through, but in this moment, they were in their own world. A world they had built together, brick by brick, through doubt and fear, through judgment and pain, through separation and reunion. In the weeks following Bethany's runway debut, something remarkable began to happen in their small town. The whispers that had once been filled with mockery took on a different tone. People who used to cross the street to avoid Bethany now stopped to ask for her autograph. Local news outlets that had ignored her story now clamored for interviews. The town's coffee shop, where people had once snickered behind her back, proudly displayed a framed copy of her magazine cover on their wall. Edward noticed the change most clearly at the diner where he still worked part-time. The same customers who had laughed at his sketches of Bethany now asked if they could buy prints of his work. He politely declined each time, knowing those early drawings were precious memories of their journey together. Sarah Miller, who had been one of their loudest critics, watched with barely concealed envy as Bethany was featured in a national magazine spread. The article highlighted not just Bethany's modeling success, but her triumph over small-town prejudice. Sarah's teenage daughter now had Bethany's photo pinned to her bedroom wall as inspiration. The local boutique that had once refused to let Bethany try on their clothes now begged to stock the fashion line she represented. The owner, Mrs. Thompson, wrung her hands nervously as she approached Bethany one afternoon. "We were wrong," she admitted, her face flushed with shame. So wrong. Young girls started approaching Bethany in the grocery store, telling her how she had given them courage to pursue their own dreams. Mothers thanked her for showing their daughters that beauty came in all sizes and colors. The movement she inspired spread beyond their town's borders, reaching other communities through social media and word of mouth. Edward's former best friend, who had spread those harmful rumors, watched from the sidelines as Edward's art gallery became a local attraction. Tourists now visited their small town specifically to see the paintings that told Bethany's story. His jealousy was evident in the way he glared through the gallery windows, seeing the success he had tried to prevent. The town's annual festival, which had once been a source of anxiety for Bethany, now featured a diversity celebration inspired by her journey. The same people who had whispered cruel jokes behind their hands now spoke proudly about how their town had always supported diversity and inclusion. Even the local high school invited Bethany to speak about body positivity and perseverance. As she stood at the podium, she could see the faces of those who had once mocked her, now sitting in the audience with forced smiles, their children hanging on her every word. Edward watched all of this with quiet satisfaction, especially when his parents' social circle began to splinter. The same elite friends who had supported their decision to cut him off now invited him and Bethany to their charity galas, eager to be associated with their success. Their obvious attempts to backtrack amused him more than anything else. The transformation wasn't instant or complete, but it was undeniable. The town that had once tried to shame them into conformity now scrambled to claim a part in their success story. Those who had laughed the loudest now smiled the widest, though their eyes often betrayed their true feelings of regret and jealousy. Bethany and Edward stood together on their back porch one quiet evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Their small victory garden, which Edward had planted during their early days of marriage, bloomed with late summer flowers. The sweet scent of jasmine filled the air. "Can you believe how far we've come?" Bethany asked softly, leaning into Edward's embrace. Her modeling photos from the latest campaign were spread across their kitchen table inside, ready to be sent to magazines across the country. Edward pulled her closer, remembering those first sketches he'd drawn of her at the diner. "I always knew you would change the world," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "From that very first day." Bethany's phone buzzed again. Another message from a young woman in Michigan who'd been inspired to pursue her dreams after reading Bethany's story. These messages came daily now, from places they'd never visited and people they'd never met. "We did this together," Bethany said, squeezing Edward's hand. The gold of their wedding bands caught the fading sunlight. Every step of the way. Letters arrived at their door almost daily, many from small towns like theirs, where people felt trapped by others' expectations. Each one spoke of how Bethany and Edward's story had given them courage to love, to dream, to stand up against prejudice. Edward thought about his latest painting series titled Love Prevails, which was currently showing in galleries across 3 states. Each piece captured moments from their journey, transformed into powerful statements about love and acceptance that resonated far beyond their small town. "Remember when we thought we were fighting just for us?" Bethany's eyes glistened with happy tears as she turned to face her husband. "But it was always bigger than that, wasn't it?" Edward nodded, gently wiping away a tear that rolled down her cheek. Their story had taken on a life of its own, spreading hope like ripples in a pond, touching lives they would never know about. They held each other close as the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, their hearts full with the knowledge that their love had not just survived, it had helped create change. Their struggle and triumph had become a beacon of hope, showing others that love could indeed conquer prejudice, that dreams were worth fighting for, and that true beauty came in all forms. In that moment, standing together in the growing darkness, they were more than just Bethany and Edward. They were living proof that courage, love, and unwavering support could not only overcome adversity, but inspire others to do the same. Their embrace held not just their love for each other, but the pride of knowing they had helped pave the way for others to follow their hearts and chase their dreams. If you enjoyed the story of Bethany and Edward, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.